So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second talk as part of our membership lecture series. My name is Paul Johnston. I am the president of the Canadian Hemochromatosis Society. A couple of rules before we get started. So first of all, I'm going to put everyone on mute, just so we don't have any distractions during the lecture. The lecture is being recorded, so you can use the stop video button if you don't want to be recorded. And as we mentioned before, you can use the chat feature in the bottom right corner. You can send a message privately to me if you can't send one publicly with your questions, and we'll do our best to get to your questions both throughout and at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Paul Adams, joining us from London, Ontario. Dr. Adams is a GI doc and professor of medicine at Western, who's been published 344 times as a leading expert in the field of hemochromatosis. Paul, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Paul. I see some old friends on the list and some new friends, and I think this was a great idea to try to connect this way, particularly during COVID. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back now.
Okay. I've been in this field of hemochromatosis since 1977, and I've had the opportunity to work with some of the most famous doctors in the world in this area, starting in Canada with my mentor, Dr. Leslie Valberg, and then I proceeded to work with Dr. Laurie Powell in Brisbane, Australia. I was there for 3 years. I worked with Dr. Pierre Brissot, who you saw not long ago on something like this. And I've also worked in 5 different countries. I've worked in Australia, US, both in New York City and San Francisco, Canada, in Kingston, Toronto, and London, and France, in Rennes, France, and in England, in Oxford, England. So I've gotten around, I've been on the run. So I've been able to study many facets of hemochromatosis, and I've often been invited to speak at places all around the world, and that's great. I don't speak nearly as much to the general public or the patients as we are tonight. And I regret that. It doesn't come up that often. I've done it in Oshawa at a big event. I've done it in Guelph. I've done it in Vancouver. I recently did it in Germany, in Heidelberg, Germany. I've done it in Milwaukee, but that's about it. And it's a very different type of lecture or interaction when I'm dealing with patients. I always learn something. And people come in all shapes and sizes, and sometimes they bring some baggage to the meeting too. And I've asked Paul Johnson, if someone gets very long-winded, he may tell them to save it for the end, or maybe just save it, period. Because we do have a finite period of time, and we can't really accommodate somebody telling their whole story from birth till age 60 on this kind of thing. And that happens sometimes in person. It definitely happened at that Guelph event, and I was lucky they had a great editor on those movies. So if you want to ask questions, I think the chat box is a good one, because the very nature of that, where you have to type your answer, means that you're probably not going to be typing your whole story. And we'll be able to answer the question very quickly, I hope. And if we can't, we can maybe go on to it at the end. Now, I would say in general, when I have been involved with patient encounters like this, there's sort of a vibe in the room often that the people that come to these events are unhappy or not satisfied or disgruntled or something like that. And they're seeking something. Usually it's information, but there's something that they're quite uneasy about. And that's why I chose this topic tonight, because this, I think, will touch on some of those feelings. And I'm going to give you my perspective on what causes some of those feelings. I don't have answers to everything. It's the kind of talk where there may be more questions than answers. And it's not all the patient's fault by any means. The doctor has some fault in this disharmony as well. And I certainly have contributed to that. And we can talk about that too. But hopefully by the end of this, we may be able to find some strategies to help you interact with your providers. And these scenarios that I'm going to be talking about are all fictitious, but they're very real. Okay, now. Okay, here's the story. The patient says, my doctor missed my diagnosis. I'd been coming there for years, having hundreds of blood tests, and apparently I had never had a serum ferritin test done. This is something I hear all the time in the clinic. Why did I have to wait till I was 60 years old to have a ferritin test? Well, I want to point out to you that serum ferritin, the blood test, was developed to test for iron deficiency, not for iron overload. And it remains a better test for iron deficiency than it is for iron overload. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you have a very low serum ferritin, like say less than 10, you definitely have iron deficiency. There's no doubt about it. There's nothing else that gives you that. That's not true when you go high. When you go high into the hundreds, the thousands, and so on, you quite commonly don't have iron overload. And I often start talks about hemochromatosis by reinforcing this idea that most people who have a high ferritin don't have iron overload. Just going to say that again. Most people with a high ferritin probably don't have iron overload. Now, this is a real baffler to a lot of patients. They thought that was the cornerstone of their diagnosis. Now, I'm going to talk in a little while about a study that I was involved with called AIRS. It was a clever name for the Hemochromatosis and Iron Overload Screening Study. And I was fortunate to get funding from the National Institute of Health. That's where that Dr. Anthony Fauci works. It's on TV all the time. And they funded the project for $34 million US. So sometimes patients say to me, we're the forgotten people. Nobody ever funds any research in our disease. That's 34 million US. That's a big project. And in that, we did blood tests on over 100,000 people, including people from London, Ontario, and from Richmond Hill, Ontario. And most of the others were in the US. And so we have a lot of information about what kind of serum ferritin tests are out there. And one of the startling observations was that 20% of all the men in the study had a high ferritin. Now, they certainly didn't have iron overload. When we looked at the whole study, there were 333 people that had genetic hemochromatosis proven by gene test. But we got 20,000 people who have a high ferritin. So that's immediately one of the problems with suggesting screening the population with ferritin or transferrin saturation. There's a lot of what we call false positives. Well, if you don't have iron overload with a high ferritin, what do you have? And this, I'm going to get into this a little bit more in the talk, but the most common things that elevate ferritin are being overweight and regular daily consumption of alcohol. Now, I have a patient from Britain. He tells me in the clinic he only drinks one night per day. So that's enough to raise your ferritin. So back when I worked in Australia with Laurie Powell, we did a study on medical students, not humans. And they were given 2 free beers a day. Can you imagine getting that approved by a Canadian ethics board? They would never go for that. And we had to watch them drink the beer at noon hour. And then we tested their ferritin every day for 28 days. And it went up and up and up. And by the end of it, in the men, it was around 800. So you can get quite a ferritin elevation from just drinking 2 beers a day. And that's not iron overload. It's the synthesis of the ferritin protein by your liver is increased. It's stimulated by the ethanol. So those two often go together, being overweight and drinking every day. You can find that on the cruise ship. And that is probably the most common reason Canadians have an elevated ferritin. And that fits so many of the patients that come to my clinic. You've probably heard people talking about things like fatty liver, NASH, metabolic syndrome. That's the same kind of spectrum of disease. Overweight, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, maybe diabetes, you're on cholesterol pills. There's lots of that out there. So that's the #1 reason for high ferritin in Canada. The next one is probably inflammation. Inflammation anywhere in the body. Usually has to be chronic, to keep the ferritin up all the time. But that would include things like arthritis. And you might say, well, arthritis is caused by hemochromatosis. It can be. Okay, so I'm going to move on to transfer and saturation. This is an older test than ferritin. This came out in the 1950s. This is not a single test. This is a fraction, like this is a quotient of serum iron divided by another test called total iron binding capacity. So that's a little bit complicated. It's not always available at every hospital. And the big problem is it's not that reliable. And I think this was it can be a real misconception among the patient groups. They think that, that's the cornerstone of the disease. If you want to pick the cornerstone of this disease, it's having the typical genetic test, C282Y homozygote, one of those genes from each of your parents. That's the cornerstone of the disease, not these iron tests where there's 18,000 false positives out of 100,000. So the genetic test is really revolutionized our diagnosis of hemochromatosis. It's the most common genetic test done in Canada by far. It's widely available. It's not an expensive test because everybody who has that C282Y homozygote, they all have the abnormality in the same place in their genome. So we know from the maps of the human genome exactly where it is, exactly where to go, and they can tell very simply, you've got it or you don't. That's not true with a lot of other genetic diseases, like say cystic fibrosis or Wilson disease, where there may be many different mutations, and therefore the testing lab has to scan the genome for many different mutations. And that's when a test can get expensive, and sometimes it doesn't come up with a result, which is disappointment. Now, this test is covered, as far as I know, by all provinces in Canada. It's supposed to be a free test. I said supposed to be. Sometimes a patient goes to a private blood drawing lab, like Life Labs or Dynacare or something like that. And they have to send that test out because they don't do it. So they will charge the patient to draw the blood and send it by courier to Kingston, Ontario, which is the provincial DNA lab in Ontario. So that's what happens when somebody says, well, I got charged for it and I thought it was supposed to be free. If you go to a hospital where they're doing the test in that hospital, which is usually a medical school type hospital, like where I work, University Hospital in London, or Toronto General Hospital, or Vancouver General Hospital, the test will be free because they're not sending it anywhere. Okay, so I mentioned this. This is the cover page of the article that we published on the big study that was called the AIR study. And this was a landmark study because we tested so many different people. The NIH was very interested in us studying different ethnic groups. So we oversampled Black people, Hispanic people, First Nations. We went to Hawaii and studied Pacific Islanders. So there's a lot of different ethnic roots in the study, but the conclusion was the same as it was when we started, that this is a Caucasian disease that comes from Northwestern Europe. This paper led to me being invited to go on the Oprah Winfrey Show, which I decided not to do. And I decided not to do that because I had been on CBC Marketplace, 17 minutes of prime time, and I got 8,000 handwritten letters. So it became really an impossible thing to do. Marie Warder was very helpful, and her group took on the task of reading all those letters. And she sent me ones where there was a specific medical question, which was about 200 of them. And I responded personally to those 200. But I was worried if I went on Oprah that there'd be 8 million letters like that. And so that's why I didn't do that. This is an old disease. And this is a real skull picture. The picture was given to me by Dr. Bradley from Dublin, Ireland, and he has been involved in a bog project, which is really fascinating. I've got some more pictures of this coming up. And they found these people 80 feet down in Ireland in peat bogs. That's P-E-A-T. It's black water. And these people are like fossilized. But some of the pictures you can see they have hair and teeth, and even some clothes are recognizable. And they were able to get DNA from these people, and these people carry some of the hemochromatosis mutations. So these people are 4,000 years old. So this is the earliest evidence for hemochromatosis, and strongly suggests that it started in Ireland. You know, there's been a story for years about, was it the Vikings, is it the Irish, is it the French? This is the current story that would support it being Irish. This is where we sampled in the AIR study. You can see London, Ontario there. And the other cities were there: Portland, Oregon, Irvine, California, Honolulu, way out to the left, Birmingham, Alabama, and Washington, D.C. These are the kinds of information that we got out of the AIR study, which are now used all over the world to predict normal ranges and reference ranges. These are serum ferritin, and on the left, the very left, is the classic hemochromatosis, C282Y homozygous. See, they have 2 copies, one from man and one from their mother. And the white box is men, and the grayish box is women. And you can see that on those 2 on the very left are higher than all the other categories. And the other categories are sort of in between genotypes. At the far right is what we call wild type. The person has no hemochromatosis mutations. And the ones in the middle are these compound heterozygotes, or 2 copies of an H63D mutation. I get a lot of calls about these kinds of cases, these intermediate cases, but they almost never have any disease. So I wouldn't worry too much about those. Here's transferrin saturation, the same group. And you see at the far left, that many of the people have an elevated transferrin saturation if you're C280Y homozygote. But there are people that don't. Those dotted lines with the bars on the end of them is the range. So you can see there's tremendous range on transferrin saturation, and it's higher in men than in women. Now here's the big problem with transferrin saturation. This is published, and everybody who had an abnormal ferritin in the AIR study was called back to have it rechecked. So this is the same people had the blood test twice. The black dots here, the solid black dots, are the C282Y homozygotes. We consider those people to have hemochromatosis. You can see that a lot of them are up at the top right corner, clustered. I don't know if that's blocked off on your view. Are people able to see the top right corner, or have you got pictures of everybody in your thing? I don't know. Paul, can you see that? Can you see the whole picture here?
Yep.
Okay, all right, okay. So the open circles are what we call control group. These are people that didn't have hemochromatosis. And the big finding here is that, that's my home phone ringing, don't worry about it. If transferrin saturation was a good test for anything, it should be reproducible. That is, if you're 50% the first day you test it, if you tested it 3 days later, it should be 50% again, or close to that. And if that would happen, there would be a straight diagonal line from the left corner to the top right corner. It would be all lined up. But that's not what's happened here. There's a tremendous scattering of values here. And you'll read in articles about hemochromatosis, they'll say, oh, the transferrin saturation is usually greater than 55%. That would be right in the middle of the graph there on the bottom. Well, you can see that if you use that cutoff, all those black dots to the left would be missed. So there's no way that's going to be a good screening test, that transferrin saturation, because you're missing so many cases. And it's not reproducible. So again, we went back to the drawing board and studied medical students. And we did a serum ferritin test on them every day and a transferrin saturation. And the transferrin saturation was never the same number twice. It's all over the place. So I'm not very excited about the transferrin saturation as a diagnostic test. It's not a useless test, but it's not as good as we once thought. Okay, so we had all this data on
Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
A question from Brenda. She was wondering if the time of the day affects the TSAT value.
That's a good question, because for years we said it did, and we were able to study that in 100,000 people, and we showed it didn't make any difference. So we no longer recommend fasting or time of day. So we've got all this data now on 100,000 patients, and at my medical school, I'm involved with teaching. And this young fellow here on the blackboard, his name was Andrew Lim. He actually works in Edmonton now. He was a curious young fellow, and he said, I'd like to get involved in some research. So I told him I had this data, and I would like to try to create some predictive equations that would predict whether people have hemochromatosis or not. So he got right up to the blackboard and started writing these kinds of equations, and he just couldn't stop. Like, he was going nonstop writing these equations. And I got my phone out and started filming it because I was so fascinated. It was a bit like that movie, The Beautiful Mind movie, where the guy is sort of possessed with mathematics. And this kid had a mathematics degree as an undergraduate. So I just fed him all this data, and he created these equations that are shown here to predict hemochromatosis. You think, well, gee, I can't remember that. But then he was clever enough to create a phone app and a website that incorporated these equations in the background. And here we see it here. This was originally an Android app, because not an Apple app, because we didn't want to pay every month to have an Apple app. It was free at the time to have an Android app. So you can see on the right here that we plug in 3 variables into this equation. Well, the top one is gender. London's kind of an old-fashioned town. At the time, we only had 2 genders, male and female. And we have transferrin saturation, 85%, and we have ferritin 700. Now, if I'd asked some of the young doctors at our hospital, they would have said, that really sounds like a hemochromatosis case. Well, the numbers churn, and it's 32% chance of having hemochromatosis. So somebody said, gee, I would have thought it would have been a lot higher. Well, what's that telling you? That's telling you that there's a lot of background noise in this sample, that there's a lot of people in this sample who have elevations in tests like that who don't have hemochromatosis. And those are the people that I told you have fatty liver and alcohol and things like that going on. So anyway, this app is also available as a website. And the website is in the top left of the slide. And I checked it recently. It's still active, the website. So you can go there and you can put your own numbers in and so on. It's questionable how valuable this tool is now that we have a genetic test that can be very simply done. Okay, so the gene for hemochromatosis was discovered in 1996. And people said, now what? Well, usually when you identify a gene, you then identify a gene product. That's what the gene is making in your body. And that leads you to understand what's really causing the disease. Well, that didn't really happen in hemochromatosis. We've got this C282Y mutation. It creates something called an HFE protein, but we don't really know what the HFE protein does. It's involved in a pathway of iron metabolism, and when it goes bad, it affects other proteins downstream. It's like a cascade that's gone bad. A lot of patients ask me whether hemochromatosis is a hepcidin disease. That's one of the new iron proteins. It's not a hepcidin mutation, but there are abnormalities in serum hepcidin, which is one of these downstream products. It could lead, when you find a gene, to a new therapeutic strategy. That is, if you knew what the gene is making, maybe you could make the product synthetically and give it to people. And people had hopes for that with hepcidin. In fact, there are several trials going on where people are getting injections of hepcidin. I don't think it's that promising. You know, there's an interest in gene therapy where they go in and try to change people's genes. Probably the most promising methodology is something called CRISPR, which is a Nobel Prize type discovery. And there was some news a year or so ago where they were doing this in China without really permission, and it was considered to be unethical. And they were doing it in utero. They were trying to change the genes of babies that were going to be born with genetic diseases. This has been kicked around for a long time. In the 1970s, they were trying to do this in the US, and somebody died. A young man died in Philadelphia having gene therapy. So there was a moratorium on this for a long, long time. It has started up again, and there are people with other diseases like thalassemia. It's a blood disease where you can get iron overload, and some of those people have been getting gene therapy to get rid of their thalassemia. So it's an exciting area, but probably not going to be that relevant to hemochromatosis families. Where the gene test is very powerful is in screening of hemochromatosis families. So once you find a typical case, they're C282Y homozygote, and you want to test the family, the people at most risk are the brothers and sisters, keeping in mind that anytime you start doing DNA testing, these are paternity tests. So you've got to be careful when you start doing this. And if you do enough families, you will definitely find some families where the father doesn't seem to be the father. And we even have one where the mother doesn't seem to be the mother. So this could be a bit awkward at an interview with the whole family there. A lot of people ask, well, if you've got a genetic test and it's not that expensive, why don't we screen the whole population? And this was one of the goals of the AIR study, to see if this would be feasible. And you probably know in Canada, in most provinces, newborn babies are screened for about 50 very rare genetic diseases, and much rarer than hemochromatosis. And why do they get screened for that? And there's this great hesitation to screen for hemochromatosis. I was interested earlier when Pierre Brosseau was speaking at this conference. Someone asked him about that, and he was quite against the idea of screening newborn babies. And in fact, he was one of the authors of the study that did that in France. And it caused a tremendous sort of furor in the ethics community and so on. Well, they had permission to do this. One of the hesitations is there are a lot of people who will have the typical genetic pattern who will never develop iron overload or clinical disease. And have we done that newborn any favors by identifying them early? And different people react to that premise differently. There is a risk of sort of a stigmatization. For example, if you identified a newborn baby with typical C282Y homozygote, anytime that child became ill with a sore throat or the flu or whatever, the mother might think it's iron overload. And then she'll go to the internet and find that Some people are bleeding their babies into their bathtub. So, I mean, there's trouble around the corner when you get into this area. We can talk about this later if you want. Okay, here's another scenario. Because my doctor never listened to my symptoms, I had to pay for a genetic panel of tests at 23andMe to make the diagnosis of hemochromatosis. And now I know I have pain from head to toe. I get this story quite a bit, not so much 23andMe, but the sort of, the doctor bungled everything and it was only me going on the internet that solved all my problems. I'll just tell you a little story about this first thing, because my doctor never listened. This is definitely one of the things that the doctors are at fault for, not everybody. So early in the 1990s, I did the first screening study using the genetic test to screen the general population. And we found this young woman, she was about 28 years old, and she was a typical C282Y homozygote. And we brought her in to tell her this, and she said, you know, I have a sister who's older than me, and they've been investigating her for liver disease for about the past 10 years, and they can't really get to the bottom of it. And this was, her sister lived in the United States and had gone to a very famous university hospital there. So she tells her sister that she's just been in this study using the new genetic test. And I had told her that her sister would have a 1 in 4 chance of having this. And if she's got a liver disease, it sounds like it could be quite possible. So she goes to this doctor at the university clinic, and the doctor says she says to the doctor, I want to be tested for hemochromatosis. And the doctor says, no, you don't. It never occurs in women. And then she says, I just told you my sister had it. Okay. Then she says, I want to have the genetic test. And the doctor says, there is no genetic test. Well, she says to him, I just told you my sister had the genetic test. So this is what I mean, examples of the doctor isn't listening to everything that the patient is telling them. And this is one of the problems. And there are different reasons for this. Some of them don't know that much about hemochromatosis. Some of them are in a big rush all the time. There are multiple factors. But now this second part of the scenario here is that once they got the results of their genetic test, they claim that they have problems from head to toe. When we did the AIR study and we tested over 100,000 people, the NIH decided that every single person would be notified with their genetic test result. This is unusual. Usually, only people who are positive get called. But they were interested in seeing how people react to genetic test results. So they had this big team of social workers and educators that insisted that the letter had to be crafted for grade 3 English, and it was also translated into 6 different languages. So, and these letters were sent to people, and the moment some of these people got this letter, they immediately fired off letters to their doctor, including me, saying they want to be on lifetime disability. So that was more common in Canada than the US, because I think there's more of these kind of social services than there are in the United States. So, and it wasn't just the people who had the typical genetic test of hemochromatosis. It was all the people who were carriers and H63D carriers and so on. They thought they had hit payday with this. Well, they didn't, but anyway, it is what it is. Now, does anybody want to comment on this? Because this is one of the most common sort of complaints I get. So there's several lessons here. The doctors have to listen more. The patients have to explain their symptoms as best as they can. You don't have to pay for a genetic test at 23andMe. The test is free in Canada. And your genetic test may or may not have something to do with your problems from head to toe. Most of the people that tell me these things, I ask them a few questions like, how much do you weigh? Oh, I'm about 380 pounds. And how much do you drink? Oh, just 24 a day, things like this. So many of these people have these other factors that could very well explain some of their symptoms. There are some people that have the classic features of hemochromatosis that are included in this bunch too. So it's a mixture. Okay. Let's see where we're going now. Okay, there's 23andMe. I'm not in the business of promoting this company. There are other companies. This is a Google company. It's out there, and I'm just mentioning it because genetics is rapidly moving in this direction. This is like a direct-to-consumer testing. And these people are interested not just in a single test. When you sign up for this, you can choose what kind of package you want, but you can get a lot of information. Like here's one of the ones where you get results on 256 genes. And you can see towards the bottom there, hemochromatosis, and it says variant absent. One of the challenges with this type of medicine is you have to be able to understand the lingo that these genetic test people are sending you. And this company has tried very hard to make it very simple, but just these comments on the right here, variant absent. What variant? What's a variant? Confidence. What does that mean? Confidence. Aren't they confident in the result? So these are problems, and people come into to my clinic now with these kinds of printouts, and this is one that's 256 genes. But I'm going to tell you in a minute about people that have had what's called whole genomic sequencing. So they now go from 256 genes tested to 30,000 genes tested. And this could be the way of the future, that everyone will have all their genes tested, and you'll be carrying that around on a USB stick on your keychain. And then you'll go into the hospital and you've got some vague pains here and there and a skin rash and so on. They'll put this USB stick in and go, oh, thank goodness you don't have that and you don't have hemochromatosis. Oh, there's something. Oh my God, you've got Huntington's chorea. So this is not good. And these incidental discoveries happen all the time when you start doing massive testing like this. And we have trouble, in Canada anyway, with genetic counselors and genetic information. And when you think of hemochromatosis, we're usually reporting on two mutations, C282Y and H63D. I wish, looking back on it, we had never started measuring H63D. We would have been better off just with C282Y. But we struggle a lot explaining two mutations to patients. So how are we going to possibly deal with explaining 30,000 genes to people? This is one of the looking into the crystal ball, into the future challenges. So this leads me to this project, which I'm glad to say I'm part of this now. This is the UK Biobank Project. This is England. And they have 450,000 participants. These are volunteers in Northern England. I have no idea what they told these people because the patients don't get any notification of the results. They just were good Samaritans, I guess, and they thought this might help somebody else or whatever. But it's curious to me that they weren't notified because you'll see they found a lot of hemochromatosis in this study. And they had this whole genomic sequencing. This is a blood test. And then they tried to determine what's the matter with these people, if they had anything at all. So they did a lot of blood tests, and they did 180,000 MRI scans, total body MRI scans. And they did these other things. These are genetic things, that's GWAS. This picture in this thing of this little railway is interesting. This is where they store 450,000 DNA samples. It's in Exeter, England. And this is one of the centers of the Biobank Project. So if you now want to go back and study a DNA on somebody that was in Manchester on such and such a date, you type it into this computer, and this little train goes down the track to the row, and then it goes up to the tray, and then it pulls the little tray out, and then the tray is retrieved back to where you started. So you think this is sort of like a toy train, but this is a real time saver, because otherwise you'd have somebody looking through boxes with barcodes or serial numbers on them. So this has been actually quite a good thing. Just to remind you about the genetics, I mentioned it earlier. This is an autosomal recessive disease. And many patients and many doctors too have kind of forgotten what this means. But the essence of it is that it's got to be on both sides of your family. It's got to be on your mother's side and your father's side. So when I see a new patient in the clinic who's a C282Y homozygote, I ask about the ancestry of their partner. I like to ask them whether they met their wife at a family reunion. It used to be quite common in Newfoundland. And they sort of choke, and I say, well, that's what the royal family does. And then they chuckle, and you know, I've thought since then that maybe they should have stuck to that, the royal family. But anyway, there's a long history of marrying within the family in the royal families in Europe. And if you find it in a patient, the people that are most likely to have it are the brothers and sisters. And you'd be surprised that a lot of patients have kind of lost touch with their brothers and sisters. So they're most interested in their children. And so no matter what you say, as soon as you tell them it's a genetic disease, they're focused on their children. But the risk to the children is actually quite a bit lower because, as I just said, the partner has to have a hemochromatosis mutation as well. It's uncommon that the parents have hemochromatosis as well, but it's possible. We studied a family from Newfoundland where both parents were C282Y homozygotes, and they had 9 children. And the oldest kid was being sent off to Western University. It was a big thing, so the whole family drove in a van all the way to London, Ontario, and the doctor in Newfoundland had told them, you gotta go see Dr. Adams in his clinic, because he'll never have seen a family like this. So they all arrived, unexpected, unannounced in my clinic, 9 of them, all different heights. These are young kids, and everyone's a C282Y homozygote, including the parents. So it was really something. Okay, so let's get back to this question about symptoms and so on of hemochromatosis. The symptoms are very non-specific, like fatigue, for example. So this is often the patient's biggest complaint, that they're tired. So anytime that we've been faced with a question in the science of hemochromatosis, we've tried to create studies to try to prove it one way or another. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to document what percent of our hemochromatosis people have fatigue. And there are these standardized surveys that are out there that you check these multi-choice questions that is trying to give you some idea whether the fatigue is mild, moderate, or severe. There's scoring systems. And you can do this for arthritis too. And a key point in this is whenever you're doing this kind of analysis, you have to also give the test to people that don't have hemochromatosis genetic mutations. This is what we call a control group. And I'll show you what happens when we do that. And it's not great news, I don't think, to many hemochromatosis people. Many of these symptoms we're talking about do not improve with phlebotomy. And in fact, some of them get worse, like the arthritis can easily get worse during the phlebotomy. And this is why I'm not that keen about some of these people who write on the blogs that you should just have phlebotomy all the time, over and over and over again. I don't agree with that. And remember, I told you at the start that an elevated ferritin can be some other cause, like obesity, alcohol, inflammation. So here's what happens. This was one of the first studies that used a control group. This was by Ernie Beutler, who was a very brilliant scientist in California. And he studied hemochromatosis people. The people in red bars are the hemochromatosis people. This is the percentage of those people that have symptoms related to the liver, diabetes, arthritis, skin pigmentation, or fatigue. And the yellow is the control group. Now, if you look at fatigue on the right there, you can see that the control patients have exactly the same percentage of fatigue as the hemochromatosis patients. Another study looked at the patients and then looked at the doctors that are administering the questionnaire to the patient. And that showed the same thing, that the doctors were just as tired or worse than the patients. So that makes it quite difficult to understand fatigue as a dominant symptom in hemochromatosis. And you can see, going to the left, pigmentation, more common in the control group. Arthritis, more common in the control group. Diabetes, more common in the control group. It was only liver disease that showed an uptick in hemochromatosis. So this led this group to make these kind of statements like, there are no symptoms in hemochromatosis other than liver disease. And this really kind of stirred up the community and so on. And other groups started to look at this, including the AIR study. And for example, we showed the same thing. Like, we could not show that diabetes was increased in hemochromatosis. Now, Marie, you know, she wrote the book, The Bronze Killer. And she was very surprised when that kind of information was starting to come out, because I think her husband had a lot of those kinds of symptoms. So this shows the power of a control group. And this is a standard scientific method that you compare one group to another group. Now, another strategy out there is people say, well, we can't screen the whole world. Why don't we just screen the people that come to the liver clinic? Well, we've done that. And this is from my liver clinic. And the black dots are, the solid black dots are people that are C282Y homozygous. Now you see this line that I've drawn at 40. This is ALT. This is a very common liver blood test. That's the upper limit of normal. So all the people to the left of that line with the black dots are hemochromatosis people that have a normal ALT. So those people would never usually have even been referred to the liver clinic. So they would have been missed. And that's why this is not a good strategy. And in fact, one of the observations is that the higher your ALT is, you see people as we go to the right, they're 150, 200, the less likely you are to have hemochromatosis. And that's because this is not an inflammatory disease. It's not like hepatitis B or hepatitis C or autoimmune, where there's all these inflammatory cells. Now the Biobank Project, I started off by talking about that. They picked out the people in that 450,000 that had hemochromatosis genetically, C282Y homozygous. And these people had filled out symptoms about their medical history. And this is a very good way to objectively assess for symptoms, because the people don't know they have hemochromatosis at the time they filled out the questionnaire. So they found about 3,000 people. So that's very high. They had 1 in 156 were C282Y homozygous. These were Caucasian people only. But that's higher than we found in the AIR study. That's higher than any city we have found in Canada. So this is a very common condition in England. So in this study, you see the top symptom is liver disease, and it's mostly in men. And that dominates. That's the odds there, 4.3. They're 4.3 times as likely to have liver disease than the people, men, without these genetic mutations. Some of these things were a surprise to me. This was exploratory. For example, rheumatoid arthritis. We don't really consider rheumatoid arthritis as the type of arthritis that people get in hemochromatosis. That has a very specific blood test associated with it, different treatments. It can be more severe. You know, people are on methotrexate and Remicade and drugs like that. So I was surprised that that came out in this analysis. Now, this is self-reported. So there are some people that have arthritis that they call it rheumatism and so on. It's really not. So again, we've got pneumonia. That's not a classic symptom of hemochromatosis. It's showing up there. You can see that there is some diabetes in this study. We're not seeing any heart disease. frequent tiredness is not a big thing. And women almost have no symptoms here. Well,